All right, guys, we're going to be starting on section 2 of chapter 3. We're going to be talking about prenatal development, early childhood, and then all the way through attachment styles and parenting styles. All right, so speaking about prenatal development, we're going to be first talking about essentially how conception and implantation occurs. So a lot of people think that when a infant or a child is conceived, it actually is conceived in the uterus, but that's actually false. It actually has to happen in the fallopian tube. So we see the uterus here on the right, and then over here is the fallopian tube kind of wrapping around. The ovary here releases the egg into the fallopian tube, and it's here within about 24 to 48 hours after ovulation, when the egg is released, that the sperm has to meet it. So it has to actually meet it here in the fallopian tube where the egg is fertilized, and then it's called a zygote, and that's just like a couple cells, and it makes a little neuroblastoma tube, and then it kind of comes down here, and at this point it's kind of folding into itself and actually forming what will become essentially the tube that turns into the embryo. And so here it actually has to come down into the uterus, and it does this implantation. Implantation happens between like 5 and 10 days after conception. So here it takes several days for it to work its way through the fallopian tube down into the uterus, and then it gets implanted into the wall of the uterus. That's when the woman's body actually recognizes that she's pregnant, and that's when it can actually be tested for with a at-home pregnancy test using urine or a blood test at the doctor's office. But it's not for the first like week or so that the woman's body even recognizes that conception has occurred. Now, sometimes the blastocyst won't actually implant, and it will just be flushed out with the next period. Other times, like the egg will just come and it'll make it to the uterus before conception can occur and the sperm can meet. So the timing is actually quite fine-tuned. It's only a couple days where the fertilization can occur, and then a couple days later when the implantation can occur. So here is some interesting imagery, I guess, of prenatal development. So across the top here, we see essentially the number of weeks of gestation. So you can see here so beforehand we call it a zygote. This is what it's like, still doing its thing. It hasn't implanted yet. And then it turns into an embryo once it's implanted, and we begin to see what looks like a little alien being here. And then at week 30, it turns into what we call a fetus, and that's when it actually begins to look a little bit more human-like. Down here, sorry, I got the weeks wrong. Around 8 weeks, excuse me. Down here to being full term at 38 weeks. This is the size. I'm sorry, I had the wrong one. So 37 weeks is what we consider to be full term, but a full pregnancy typically is 40 weeks. So it's not actually really 9 months, it's more like 10 months. Everyone kind of lied. Women typically won't know that they're pregnant until at least week 2 when they miss their period. But if a woman has irregular cycles, it could be even 8 to 12 weeks before the woman actually knows she's pregnant. Not all women have obvious symptomology of pregnancy. Some women can't even really test to see if they're pregnant with their urine. Rarely women will be pregnant very far along and have used pregnancy tests at home and have gotten negative results just because it doesn't show up. The hormone doesn't show up in their urine. Now down here, there's really interesting information about different malformations that occur with sensitive periods. We'll talk more about sensitive periods in the future in a couple slides. But so if something happens, if it's in the red period, that means that it's a really sensitive part where things could go wrong. The yellow part is where, if something occurs, it's going to be a little bit less detrimental, but it still won't be great outcomes. And you can see like this one here, this is neural tube defect, spina bifida. This is a very severe and long process here. And then only later on is the central nervous system kind of in the clear. It can be quite a long period of time for that to develop, and it stays highly sensitive for a long period of time. So again, here are the stages of prenatal development. So the germinal stage is the first stage. We begin with the formation of the zygote, and then that ends after about 2 weeks. And then the outer portion of the zygote develops into the cluster of cells that attaches itself to the uterine wall. Then that begins the embryonic stage. That's from 2 weeks to about 2 months of age, or 2 months gestation. That's when the major structures and organs of the body begin to develop, and the embryo starts to resemble a human being. Kind of looks like a tadpole before then, even has a tail and everything, and gills. And then fetal development is from 2 months until birth, and that's when the developing organism is called a fetus. And then that's when the mother will actually really begin to look pregnant, because it's getting larger and the uterus is expanding. And then all the bodily structures and organs will complete their growth by 37 weeks or so of age. All right, so humans are actually born in what we consider to be a premature state. So if you compare humans to other primate species, we can't do a whole lot of birth. When a human baby is born, all they really do is eat, sleep, poop, and cry. They don't do a whole lot. If you look at like baby chimpanzees, within a matter of a couple hours after birth, they're already clinging onto mom. They can nurse without assistance. They can kind of toddle around a little bit. They're not super strong, but they can hold on to mom without any assistance. So they usually will grab onto her hair around her chest, and they can hold on without a problem. Human babies can't do that. And the reason why we can't do a whole lot compared to a lot of other animals, think of like horses, and elephants and giraffes, like within a matter of like an hour after birth, like they're already running around, like they're super strong. Human babies can't walk until a year of age, on the good side. So we're pretty slow to develop. But that's because humans are bipedal species. So when we went from quadrupeds, like chimpanzees walking on all fours, and we stood up on our 2 feet and had our heads up in the air, the hips and pelvis of the human actually had to narrow a little bit. And in that process, it narrowed the birth canal. And so if babies were born at essentially the same part of development that chimpanzees are born, they have to be born, not just 9 months gestation, but 9 months, an additional 9 months, 10 months even a year. The baby be way too big. Imagine a woman carrying around a 1-year-old in her uterus. Like, that's crazy, and there's no way that child could be born. And so their heads are just too big to leave the birth canal. So humans, as became bipedal, the birth canal narrowed, and then babies were kind of being born in a more premature state. But we humans are very smart creatures, and we invest a lot in our infants, and we can take a lot of time with them, and we have close family connections that can help support a mother who's just given birth. And so we take care of our babies for a really long period of time. We have this really slow developmental process that allows our brains to develop as well as our bodies to physically mature outside of the womb. So the interesting thing is, though, babies really have a surprising ability to learn through their sensory information. So babies have a set of reflexes that we're born with. Now, it doesn't mean that they're innate, genetically coded things, but they're born with some basic abilities that allow them to learn about the world. So the first one is grasping. So if you put your hand or your finger into a baby's hand, they're going to hold onto your finger, and it's going to be a really tight grasp. Another one is called rooting, which means that if you rub the baby's cheek, they're going to turn their head and open their mouth in anticipation of a nipple or a bottle in order to feed. They also have a sucking reflex. If you put something in their mouth, they're going to suck on it. So they like pacifiers, and then of course that helps them eat. They also have what's called the moral reflex. That's if you hold the baby kind of out in your arms and you quickly kind of like drop your arms, the baby's going to stretch their arms out and then pull them in. Essentially, like they're trying to like grasp onto something and make sure that they're not going to fall. So babies have this like basic set of reflexes, and even we adults have reflexes. We orient to a large noise. So if someone knocks on the door, you're going to turn your head and look in that direction. If I shine a bright light in your eyes, you're going to blink and close your eyes, you're going to move your head out of the way. These are basic reflexes that we all have, and babies have them too. So there's a video on the playlist I'd like you to watch about reflexes that's really good, so check that out, and it's really cute as well. Infant brains are capable of learning almost anything. It doesn't matter where a baby is born, what time period a baby was born in, they're going to be able to adapt and learn from their surroundings and be very successful. Babies are born with highly plastic brains. We've talked about this in our last chapter. So damage to the brain in infancy often results in very little issue. Their brains can readapt and regrow and relearn things that would otherwise, incapacitate us as adolescents or adults or older people. So you saw the video last time with the girl living with half of her brain. Make sure you check that out because that really shows the extent that the brain can really adapt to extreme circumstances. So our neurons are, our brains, as we talked about in the last chapter, they make new connections, and these new connections are strengthened through use. But unused connections are pruned over time. So if the brain doesn't need that pathway anymore, it's going to trim them away and use those materials for something else. So it's kind of like a road. What started off maybe as a footpath will turn into a paved sidewalk, which will turn into a paved road, which will turn into a superhighway. But if it stopped being used, imagine all humans were wiped out. Eventually the pavement's going to crumble and it's going to go away. Or the workers will move the road somewhere else. It'll pick it up, destroy it, and build a new road elsewhere that becomes more appropriate. So our neurons are making new connections, but then also the connections that aren't being used are being taken away, and our brain's becoming more efficient over time. The rate of motor maturation also varies from child to child. Typically, though, the order is the same. So first, a baby has to learn to hold their head up. They don't have great neck muscles when they're born, and their skulls are very soft. And so they have to have a lot of neck support. So if you've ever picked up a young baby, you have to hold their head up when you're moving them around because they don't have the neck control. What's one of the things that they do with babies? They do tummy time. You put the baby down flat on their belly, and they have to learn to hold their head up, and then also strengthens their back muscles, their neck muscles, their abdominal muscles, and they have to essentially prop themselves up on their elbows and get their head up and be able to look around. And babies usually don't like this. They'll cry quite a bit, especially at the beginning, but that tummy time is really important because it helps strengthen that head and that neck. So first they learn how to lift their head, then they have to learn how to sit up. Usually they sit up first with the support of like a toy. Usually they have like little boppy seats or little pillows and stuff to help them sit up. Then they'll sit up, they call it tripod stance, where they have their legs out like kind of splayed and their hands in the middle to hold them up. And then eventually they'll be able to use their hands and sit up independently using their abdominal muscles to hold them up. Then babies learn how to crawl, although some babies actually skip crawling. And there's a variety of different ways babies crawl. So the traditional way is with their hands on the ground and on their knees, and they walk like that. But they also do what's called a bear crawl, where they'll be actually on their feet, not their knees, and their butts are way up in the air. Sometimes they'll army crawl, where they're not going to really use their legs, and they'll use their arms to pull themselves around. Some babies will scoot, so they'll sit on their butts and then they'll scoot backwards. And other babies, like myself, roll. So we just roll from place to place. That's very rare, and I'm a special being. Most babies learn how to crawl. And then they learn to pull themselves up. So they'll hold on to mom's hand, or they'll pull themselves up onto some furniture or in their crib. Then they learn how to walk with support. So they'll learn how to walk with holding their hands, or what they call cruising, from piece of furniture to piece of furniture around the house. And then they learn how to walk independently, and then they can run. But they have to practice these behaviors. It's not just something where they're like, boom, I'm born and I know how to crawl now, or I know how to walk. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's a long process. And even when you see kids walking, they don't just like walk beautifully at first. They kind of toddle around. They stand on their tippy toes. They have their hands up and out to the side for balance. You can kind of tell how long a child's been walking by how flat-footed they are, and then if they have their hands down by their side versus up in the air. So you can tell, a brand new walker from a walker who's been doing it for a couple weeks, because they've really changed the way that they move around. It's pretty cool. So sensory development in early infancy. So neonates, so newborn babies, can see, hear, smell, taste, and respond to pain and touch. And that's really impressive, because that's a lot for a baby to do right at birth. But a lot of their senses aren't quite as acute or as strong as our adult senses, but they really quickly develop. So for an example, babies at birth, they don't see very well. Their eyes can't focus. So they can see best for things that are about a foot away from their face, which is actually perfect because when you hold a baby to nurse or to feed a baby, their head's about 1 foot away from your face. So they can actually see mom or whoever is feeding them, their caretaker's face, really clearly. Not super clearly, but that's the best vision that they're going to have. Babies within about 48 hours can already recognize their moms, which is pretty amazing. By 4 months, they have what we would consider to be drivable vision, so they wouldn't need corrective lenses if they were driving, but they're 4 months, so they're not going to drive for a while. But their eyes are pretty sharp at that point. Babies can see color at birth. It's just not quite as fine-tuned as our own. So like bright primary colors, things with a lot of contrast are better. They get their attention more. But they can see color. It's a myth that babies can't see color at birth. Babies will follow their eyes, objects with their eyes. So visual attention is incredibly important. They will follow things around their environment. They like bright, flashy things. Again, there's lots of contrast. But we as researchers actually we do this, we harness this ability for them to look at things to allow us to study infant cognition or infant thought. So what we do is we will show a baby something. There's a couple different methods, but one of them is called habituation. So what we do is we show a baby, let's say, a picture of a face. And they see that face and they get really excited by it. And they'll look at it for a long time. And then eventually they get bored and they look away. And then we put the face up again. And they look at it and they're like, all right, that's interesting, but it's not as fun as it was the first time. So they'll look, but they'll look a little bit less time. And then we'll do it again, we'll do it again, we'll do it again, and over and over and over again until their attention decreases. And then we show them a new face. If they notice it's a new face, meaning that they learned the first face, their attention actually spikes and they're going to look at it for longer than they did the last time they saw the familiar face. So this is called habituation because we habituate them or make them bored to whatever we showed them first, and then we try to see if there's a change in their attention. I'll put a video, there's going to be a video about that on the YouTube channel so you can see a baby habituating. Another one that we use is called paired preference. We can tell what babies prefer to look at. So babies like to look at things that are complicated. They would rather look at a star than a circle because there's just more cool edges. They also like to look at faces pretty much more than anything. So if you show them a picture of a face and a picture of a star, they're going to like to look at the face more. If you show them equally complicated things, so a face and, a car, they like to look at the face more. They also like to look at upright faces more than upside down faces. And we also know that babies like to listen to familiar sounds more than unfamiliar sounds. So they actually prefer mom's voice very quickly after birth. They, at birth, will prefer mom's smell, mom's native language, mom's breast milk. All of this is due to prenatal exposure to sound, which we talked about before. And also they get some taste and smell from their amniotic fluid based off of what mom is consuming. So there's some really cool research where they had moms drinking tea that's flavored with anise, which is like a black licorice flavor, which is really popular in Europe, which is where they do these studies. And babies whose mothers drank anise tea when the baby was in gestation, they preferred the smell of anise over something like lavender or vanilla at birth, which is pretty cool. Babies can also recognize their mom's amniotic fluid smell, and then within a few hours actually recognize their mom's breast milk smell because the breast milk is also composed of compounds that are related to what the mom's been consuming, which the babies are familiar with. So it's pretty cool. These abilities allow babies to quickly learn patterns, learn language sounds, and categories of animals really, really quickly. It's pretty amazing what babies can do, even though we think of babies as being pretty boring and pretty basic creatures. They learn a lot and they learn it very, very quickly. Readiness is a condition that exists when maturation has advanced enough to allow for rapid acquisition of a particular skill. So for example, potty training. The child has to be mature enough to control their body. It also helps with their verbal in order to potty train. So it can be quite a difficult process, but children have to understand like how to hold their bladder and then release it voluntarily. So typically the start for potty training is about 18 to 24 months. Girls usually a little bit younger than boys. Boys can take to 3 to 4 years of age. It just takes them a little bit longer. So it takes some time for children to learn how to do that and control it voluntarily. They'll go for longer periods of time with dry diaper, as well as like newborn babies. They kind of just pee a little bit every few minutes, when their body kind of builds up some urine. Reading is the same way. You can't like force a child to learn how to read too young. Otherwise, you just cause stress for yourself and the child. So reading is a skill that takes some time, and the brain has to be mature enough to handle that amount of information. It's also, exposing children too young to something. It just causes problems for everyone involved. So reading is something that like on the early end, probably 4 years of age, but 5, 6 years of age isn't that big of a deal. So I mentioned this before, but sensitive periods, these are periods during development where the individual has an increased sensitivity to environmental influences. So during that time, if these events don't take place, they don't have normal development. So, for an example, bonding with caretakers has to happen within the first couple of years of life, or else a child won't ever be able to form normal bonds with other humans. This doesn't usually have any problems. Babies who are around their caretakers regularly are going to have normal bonding, and it won't be a problem. But children who are who are victims of abuse and neglect, or children who have been in substandard care, especially in like orphanages, in the past, they would have attachment problems. So you have to have normal development of like that caregiver bond, or else things kind of go awry. And there's a really interesting podcast about this on Canvas you should check out, from I believe Radio Lab or This American Life, one of those. It's interesting. It's excellent. You should check it out. Um, but this actually kind of came to the forefront in the 1990s. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people couldn't take care of their children anymore, and there was a lot of kids who were in severe poverty. So their parents relinquished them to orphanages. And once camera crews got into the Soviet Union, they saw, they brought back footage of these really beautiful little babies in cribs, 10 deep, there's all these cribs in a room. And a lot of Americans decided they wanted to adopt these kids. And a lot of them were adopted. They brought them to the United States. And the ones who were adopted before about 2 years of age did pretty well. But the children who were adopted later oftentimes had huge problems adjusting to life in a traditional family. They couldn't develop bonds. They were very detached from their caregivers. They would walk off with strangers. They just had no kind of sense of affection and love because they just hadn't had it in the first couple of years of life. At these orphanages, while the children were well fed and they were kept clean and hygienic, they were never given that socialization process that needs to occur. It's kind of like, feral cats or something. If they're not given, cuddling and human attention in the first couple of weeks of life, they're just never going to be able to adapt to that. And that's what was happening with these children. And it was really disruptive for a lot of these families, and some of them even relinquished these children afterwards because they couldn't get them to kind of bond with the family. And it wasn't just like, oh, the child was indifferent. They actually had a lot of emotional problems and violence even as a result because they just couldn't understand human, affection. It was very strange. Language development also has a sensitive period. So children have to be exposed to language within the first 3 years or so of life, or else they're not going to develop normal language abilities. So kids who are hearing impaired, if they get a cochlear implant, which can allow them to hear, if they get that before about 3 years of age, they typically will have close to typical processing of audiovisual speech. But if they don't get that, they're going to struggle with some of these aspects. Now, I say it's a sensitive period. You'll hear it sometimes called, like in the textbook, I think they were calling it a critical period. That's kind of the older language. So critical period kind of assumes that like this window opens and then it shuts and then that's it. But a sensitive period kind of infers that there's a little bit more gradual sloping off of the time when this enrichment has to occur. So like it's not exactly 3 years of age, boom, on your birthday, you can't learn language anymore. It will gradually close. And we see that even for second language learning. If you learn a second language as a young child, it's not a big deal. But gradually, from about age 6 and on, it just slowly closes. So by the time you enter puberty, it's very difficult for most people to learn a second language if they didn't have one already. So that's what we mean by a sensitive period versus a critical period. Deprivation and enrichment. So environments can either be described as either deprived or enriched. So think of a hamster cage. If you have just essentially a clear plastic cage, a little bit of sawdust, food bowl, water, and maybe a wheel, that's just a basic hamster cage. But if you had a big hamster colony, the whole bunch of different plastic areas and tubes that they could go through and toys and other hamsters for them to play with, that would be an enriched cage. So if you think about human environments, they can be either deprived or enriched. So deprivation is any loss or withholding of normal stimulation, nutrition, comfort, love, and so forth. And just a condition of absence. So feral children are children who have either been neglected, abused, or more traditionally have been raised away from humanity, either by animals or somehow managed to survive on their own. There are some famous cases of this, and I'm going to put a video on YouTube as well for you to check out of feral children. Some of the stories are pretty weird, and they're very old-timey. This doesn't happen very often. I know I don't really trust reports from the 1700s about this child who was raised by wolves, but there are some cases, and there's an excellent article about this on Canvas, where people more modern, currently alive people who were raised primarily on their own or with packs of dogs and stuff. There's one called A Man Raised by Wolves. That's the article on Canvas. And they have extreme cases of deprivation you should check out. Also, children of war, severe poverty, even moderate poverty. If they don't have great nutrition, parents are working a whole lot, they don't have a lot of toys or books, maybe they're just watching TV all the time, that would be a condition of deprivation. Enrichment, on the other hand, is deliberately making an environment more stimulating, nutritional, comforting, loving, etc. A lot of your parents are doing that. You're in an enrichment type school where we offer really great courses and books and iPads and scanning electron microscopes and all kinds of really cool stuff that allows you guys to have this enrichment. But even as a child, you guys probably were in lessons and played sports and got to go on vacations and had great toys. So that's all part of the enrichment idea. And in the government, we actually pay for enrichment programs such as free daycare or subsidized preschool, where kids can go, such as Head Start. That's the big national program that kids can get this enrichment at a really young age. So if you look at a kid who's been through preschool, kindergarten, and then they go to first grade, they're usually much more advanced than a child who's just going into first grade, unless the parents have made a significant effort to really enrich their environment. And they found out back in the 1980s and 1990s that kids who were going into first grade without any education, they ended up more likely to not graduate. They're more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to be on government support later on. So they found out that for every dollar we spend on Head Start educational programs for preschoolers and kindergartners, we save $100 in the end when they're adults. So a lot of states have actually made it policy that all kids have to go to kindergarten, and they've made even pre-K free or reduced costs for most families. In the state where I grew up in New Hampshire, kindergarten wasn't something that was supported by the government, and my parents actually had to pay extra for me to go to kindergarten. But in Florida, you see the VPK and things like that, and these are kind of part of these intervention programs to make sure all children are getting access to quality education from a very young age. All right. So we talked about nature and nurture before. So we think of nature as the genetics and environment, the nurture part kind of acting on the child. But we have to understand that children also influence their environment, and the environment influences the child. It goes both directions. It's not just a child is there and the environment happens to them. Children, in the way that they behave, actually changes how the environment responds to them. This happens from a very, very young age, not just as teenagers, whether you're mean or nice to your parents that day. So what we call this is temperament with infants. So that's the physical core of one's personality, including emotional and perceptual sensitivity, energy levels, and a typical mood. So we classify babies in like three major categories. So 40% of babies are what we consider to be easy babies or easy children. These babies are smiley, happy babies. They don't cry a whole lot unless there's a physical need for them to cry or they're like really bored or uncomfortable. These are easygoing babies. If they do start crying, they're very easy to soothe. 10% of babies are what are considered difficult babies. They cry a lot. New experiences freak them out. New foods like take weeks to adjust to. They really need a schedule. Otherwise, like if you adjust anything, they just it's a problem, and they take a long time to warm up to new people. And then we have 15% are in the slow to warm up category. They're kind of in between. They're happy kids unless there's a major shift, and then it takes them some time to adjust, but then they warm up and then they're okay. The rest of the kids, I know that doesn't add up to 100%. They don't fit into one category. That's a lot of babies. But think about, if you were to babysit an easygoing child, you're going to play with them. You're going to show them new toys. You're going to sing songs to them. If you were a parent of an easygoing child, you're going to take them out to the grocery store and out to dinner, and you're going to have all your friends over, and like you play with your baby, and your baby plays with the environment, and it's all wonderful. Babies who are difficult, though, their parents probably going to keep them at home more. They're not going to bring them to the store because they're worried about them crying and screaming the entire time. They're not going to show them different foods. They're just going to kind of keep them more protected. So it's interesting. Easygoing babies actually elicit more smiles and more speech from their caretakers. So just this basic temperament of the child actually changes the environment the child is raised. And it will change the way the caretakers approach them and offer new experiences, which is important in shaping their early environment. This can also begin to shape how the child reacts to basic struggles. So I want you guys to watch this video about the marshmallow task. There's two of them on there. One of them is the traditional marshmallow task. So what they do is they bring a young kid into a room and they place a marshmallow on a plate in front of them and they say, you can eat this marshmallow right now. Or if you can wait like 15 minutes, I'm going to leave the room, and when I come back, I will give you a second marshmallow, so you have two marshmallows instead of one marshmallow. And then the adult leaves the room and they watch what happens with the child and the marshmallow. Some kids immediately pop that marshmallow in their mouth and it's over. Some kids can wait the entire time, the 15 minutes without a struggle. Other kids, they struggle with it. They may nibble on the corner of the marshmallow. They may kiss it. They may sniff it. They may try to distract themselves from it. But how the child interacts with this task shows a lot about their ability to delay gratification. Now, if you think about it, you guys have to delay gratification all the time. So you have to decide to not watch the next episode of Stranger Things on Netflix, but instead you will read your history book or you'll write your essay. There's a lot that goes on day to day that is you waiting to fulfill that momentary gratification. And that gets learned in early childhood. And this marshmallow task is kind of an initial assessment of this. Now, the second video online. So the initial study of the marshmallow task showed that kids who were able to delay eating the marshmallow to get the second one, they had higher SAT scores, more likely to go to college, have higher earnings as adults, like all these wonderful things. If you could delay gratification as a 4-year-old, man, you could just nail it as an adult. But it turns out, and there's a second video about this I want you guys to check out, that assessment wasn't quite true. So a lot of it had to do with scarcity in childhood. If a child, think of it, if you're a kid who doesn't have a whole lot of wealth in your family, your parents are like, oh yeah, if you clean up your chores, you're going to get this treat. But then when it comes down to it, they don't have that. Or, they don't always have food to eat right away when they need it. They're going to be more likely to eat that marshmallow. Or if your parents promise, like, yeah, we'll go to Disney at the end of the school year if you get all A's, and then the end of the school year comes and there's no money to go, you're more likely just to take that momentary reward, like, screw the A's, like, let me just have fun, because if I get A's or if I get a B, who cares, because I'm not going to go to Disney World either way. So kids are really good at picking up cues from their environment of what's going to be there the next time they're ready to get that reward. There's also another facet of the study that they showed if the adult was someone that the kids could trust, they were more likely to wait. So in one experiment with the marshmallow, before the marshmallow task actually occurred, they had the kids coloring in a coloring book, and they said, oh, let me go back. I have some markers in the next room. I'll bring them back for you to play with. And then the adult would leave and come back. And in this condition where the adult was reliable, they'd bring the markers back, and then they would, after a few minutes, they would begin the marshmallow task. In the other condition, the adult would come back and be like, oh, I'm sorry, I guess I don't have any markers. I don't have them today. And so the kid would learn, like, well, that adult's not reliable. I can't trust that person. So when they gave them the task with the marshmallow, the kid's like, I'm just going to eat this marshmallow. They're probably not going to come back with a second one. They couldn't bring back markers. There's no way they're going to bring back marshmallows. And so the kids learned really quickly whether they could trust that adult or not in that situation. So watch those videos. They're hilarious to see the little kids like struggling to not eat the marshmallow. I really think you're going to enjoy that video. Developmental level. So within an individual, their current state of physical, emotional, and intellectual development is considered their developmental level. There's 3 factors that come together to determine that level, and it's bidirectional over time. So we have hereditary, we've talked about, the environment, and then their own behavior. So like we've talked about with temperament, their own behavior acts upon the environment, and the environment acts upon them, and then that actually goes back to turning up or turning down different genes within the epigenetic system. So this is a really famous graph on the bottom right here. We have genetic activity that influences your neural activity, that neural activity then influences your behavior, and your behavior then influences the environment. So let's say you have a lot of testosterone, and so therefore you have a lot of energetic activity, which means you're going to be more aggressive, which means that you're going to be a really good football player. But then because you're a good football player, it changes your behavior, you work out more often, and then it changes your nervous system, and then it makes you faster on the field, and it'll like essentially change your genetics and turn up some athletics or increase the amount of testosterone you have. So it's always over time in your development, but these things all act upon each other. It's not just one level acting upon another level. It's always changing over time. All right, so some emotional development in infancy. So basic emotions are present at birth, and these are things that babies will show right from day one. So distress, which we typically see as crying, contentment, interest, and disgust. If you put something gross tasting in a baby's mouth, they're gonna like recoil from it. They're gonna give you the funniest face, and they're gonna be like, ugh, that's nasty, I don't wanna taste that or smell that. By 7 months, they begin to show more complicated emotions such as surprise, anger, fear, sadness, and joy. There's a great video about surprise and how it's used for research purposes on the YouTube channel, so check that out. But the most common emotion that babies express is interest. They like to look around the environment. They like to look for new things. They like to check out the world. And babies begin to smile around 6 months of age, or 6 weeks of age. Before that, if babies, like, you know, if you ever see like your newborn cousin or something and they smile, it's typically just gas, or just, you know, their face moving around. But babies begin to smile from social stimulus around 6 weeks of age. And then when babies smile, it makes their caretakers smile and then engages them more. So social smiles are smiles elicited by a social stimulus, such as another face, typically their parent's face. They smile a lot for that. Emotions that are more complicated, such as embarrassment, take a lot longer to develop because you have to know what's right and what's wrong and that you broke a social norm in order to feel embarrassed. And that kind of relates to theory of mind, which we're going to get to later on in this chapter. Now, there's a really great video also on YouTube about the still face experiment. I want you guys to check out. That's an experiment where the mom will interact with their baby, usually in a high chair, and the parent will be talking to the child for about a minute or two, and then all of a sudden the parent turns away, turns back, and then at that point their face is completely still, motionless. They don't talk, they don't make any like noise, they just like make eye contact. And the babies are like, what the heck is going on? So they go from like normal to like, hey mom, like what you doing? They'll kind of like, you know, point at mom, or they'll try to talk to mom, babble, and then if it keeps going, the baby will be like, what's going on? They try every trick. They'll start crying, they'll start screaming, they'll start pointing, they'll get really upset, and then all of a sudden they just like stop. They're like, never mind, you're ignoring me, so I'm gonna ignore you. And they like look away from the mom all mad. And they do this for like 1 to 2 minutes, and then the mom essentially like comes back alive and happy and normal, and then you see the resolution of the baby kind of like coming back to normal and being like, all right, I guess that was weird, but whatever. And so it's actually kind of cool to see this experiment take place, and they explain it really nicely in the video, so you should check that out. So social development. So affectional needs are emotional needs for love and affection. So we have these emotional attachments. We talked about a little bit back when we were talking about sensitive periods. So these emotional bonds are the ones that we have that are really close between infants and their parents, caregivers, and other people. It could be mom and dad, it could be grandma and grandpa, aunts, uncles, siblings, even people at daycare. It can be babysitters, whoever's in their environment, and it's someone that they've learned that they can trust. This helps develop their self-awareness and awareness of other people. And early attachment studies showed that even monkeys kind of had this emotional attachment. So in this one study, Bowlby, I believe, is the researcher. This is in the 1960s, before we had some of our ethical standards that we use today. What he did is he took baby monkeys and he placed them in a cage with 2 surrogate mothers. One was made of wire, and then the other one was wire covered in cloth. And then the one with cloth didn't have a bottle, but the one with the wire had the bottle. So if you were looking at essentially survival, the one with the bottle would make much more sense for the baby to cling to, because that was going to provide the nutrition. But it turned out the babies would spend all their time on the cloth mom, but only if they really needed to. If they were hungry, they would go over to the wire one, or they would just stretch over and try to get to the bottle without leaving the cloth one. So they really, really did prefer to spend the time with the one that was soft and cuddly and more not human-like, but monkey mama-like, and allow them to kind of feel that comfort. And that comfort is really important. So here's an example of kind of the setup here. This is 2 side-by-side images. You can see the cloth mother and the wire mother. It's kind of weird looking, but you can see where the bottle would be placed. So typically the bottle would be in the wire mama monkey, and the baby would have to reach over or climb over to get any milk to feed. Again, if you listen to the emotional attachment podcast, I talk about attachment disorders. They also talk about Harlow's monkey experiments, and it's really interesting to learn about this. Okay, so attachment, it starts with contact comfort. That's the pleasant and reassuring feeling that humans and animal infants get from touching and clinging to something that's warm and soft, and usually that's their mother. So we wrap babies up in blankets, we cuddle them, we do what's called skin to skin or kangaroo care, which is really important when a baby's first born. You put them on the mom or dad's skin so they can feel their warmth, and it actually helps regulate their body temperature and their heart rate and their breathing. So doing that skin-to-skin contact is very important. And then we see with kids that they're removed from that person who's their comfort. They get what's called separation anxiety. This is distress that's displayed by infants when they're separated from their parents or primary caregivers, usually beginning between 8 and 12 months. So at that point, they're like, you're my mom or you're my dad, and I like you, and these other people are strangers, and I don't know them, so why are you making me get away from them? And when that happens, they get distressed. They start crying and screaming. They get really emotional. And this is a perfectly normal response. It's pretty typical for babies to show some separation anxiety between these ages. Now, 1 in 20 children will suffer from what they call separation anxiety disorder. This is a much more severe fear, where if they're separated from their primary caregiver at all, they just go into complete meltdown, and it takes them a really long time to settle down, and it will last for longer than that 8 to 12 month stretch. But most of them will quickly outgrow that after a couple of years. So Mary Ainsworth is this researcher, and she was interested in finding a way to measure how children became attached to their caregivers. And so she wanted to look at what we call attachment. And there's different types of attachment. And the way that she measured this was called the strange situation. I put a video about this on the channel. You should check it out. But in the strange situation, what they're doing is they have about a 12-month-old baby and their mom, and they go into the lab and they're playing There's toys and a couple other things for the baby to kind of do, but the mom's just supposed to sit there and kind of read a magazine while the baby plays. And you kind of see how the baby learns to explore the room. They kind of check back with mom, everything's okay, and they'll play around. And then a stranger walks in the room, and the kid's like, who is this? And the stranger will sit down and kind of ignore the child, sit down next to the mom, no big deal. Then the stranger will try to engage the child to play with them. And again, the child will kind of look back up at mom, like, is this person okay? And then after a few minutes of this, the mom gets up and leaves the room. And the stranger and the baby are alone in the room. And essentially, it's like how the baby reacts. Are they upset? Or they don't care? Are they upset, but like really upset? And then the mom comes back in, and we see how the baby reacts to the mom. Are they upset? Are they calmed almost immediately? Do they reject the mother? So we can actually tell what type of attachment a child has based off of how they will react when the mom leaves and when the mom comes back. So the most common and the best form of attachment is called a secure attachment. This is the stable and positive emotional bond. When the mom leaves, the child is upset, but when the mom comes back, they're quickly calmed down and everything's okay. And they look to mom for support, but everything's quickly resolved. In insecure avoidant attachment, that's an anxious and emotional bond marked by the tendency to avoid reunion with the parent or caregiver. So they'll be upset when mom leaves, but then when they come back, they're like, oh no, like that was terrible. Like they just kind of reject the mom and they won't calm down. And then insecure ambivalent attachment is anxious emotional bond marked both by a desire to be with the parent or caregiver, but then some resistance to being reunited. So when mom comes back in, she picks up the baby and the baby clings to her, but then won't calm down. It takes so long for that child to calm back down and feel stable again. So attachment is really important for early children, for young children. It has lasting effects. Children who are securely attached show greater social skills, resiliency, curiosity, and problem-solving abilities. And if there's attachment failures, it can be really harmful. We talked about overcrowded orphanages. These children had attachment failures. They didn't have any attachment because their caregivers at the orphanage didn't emotionally take care of them, only physically took care of them. Over time, they can have difficulty maintaining stable relationships throughout their lives. So they can't attach later on to later caregivers, or they can't create emotional lasting bonds with romantic partners later on. Children with this attachment failures typically are anxious and remote. They might wander off with strangers, and they'll refuse touch and eye contact even. They don't even want to be anywhere near other people. So here's a nice little infographic of the 4 different types. We didn't talk about disorganized, but they just like don't care when the parent leaves, and then like they don't really care when the caregiver comes back. So here's kind of a little bit more up close. I know the image isn't great, but take a second and read over that. And then here's the next ones, avoidant and disorganized. Okay. So a lot of parents ask how they can promote secure attachment with their child. Generally speaking, secure attachment happens kind of normally, but some parents can disrupt it through poor behavior. So typically if the parent is accepting and sensitive to the child's signals, everything's going to be fine. But some moms or caregivers who will provide inadequate, inappropriate, and intrusive, overstimulating, or rejecting behaviors can cause insecure attachment over time. So sometimes they'll play vigorously with a sleepy infant, or they'll ignore the child completely, not just, a few minutes, cried out, no big deal. But if they just completely ignore the child's vocalizations, that can promote an insecure attachment or an attachment failure. So as long as the parents are reacting normally to their child's signals, then they should have a secure attachment. A lot of parents are also concerned about daycare. If they have their child go to daycare, is that going to destroy the attachment between the infant and the mother? And that's not the case. Unless it's very poor quality childcare, there's not going to be a problem with the attachment between the infant and the mother. So generally speaking, high quality childcare actually improves children's social and mental skills. They have better cognitive skills and greater language skills. They just get more exposure to a lot of different situations and children, and they can learn a whole lot. But low quality childcare can weaken attachment and create new behavioral issues. Kids will learn to bite and hit and learn bad words. So people should be looking for responsive and sensitive childcare providers, a small child to teacher ratio. So each state kind of has its own rules, but it's like 5-to-1 ratio for like 5 children to 1 caregiver, I think before 3 years of age. And then the caregivers should be well trained, and the staff should be stable. You shouldn't have new people coming in and out all the time, because that can make it confusing for the children. Now, that's essentially the parent and the infant, but as parents, as children get older, the way that the parents interact with the child can change, and these are called parenting styles. There are 4 identifiable patterns of parental caregiving and interaction with children. The first of this is called the authoritarian style. So these people enforce really rigid rules and demand strict obedience to authority. So these parents are the really strict, almost militaristic in their style. So their catchphrase would be, "Do it because I say so." And it's like, if they ask you to jump, you just say, "How high?" Like, they just put down the rules and that's it. They'll use what's called power assertion. This could be physical punishment or coercion to enforce child discipline. They may use what's called withdrawal of love, which would be withholding affection to enforce child discipline. The outcome for these children is typically they have lower self-esteem, which is one's regard for oneself. And they don't understand why rules are in place. They will follow them, but they don't know why those rules are important. The second type is overly permissive parents. These parents give too little guidance, they allow too much freedom, and they don't require the child to take responsibility for their actions. So their catchphrase would be, "Do whatever you want, just have fun, like I'm your best friend." You probably have seen these parents. These children are aimless and they run amok. They typically will have very high self-esteem and high senses of entitlement, but they're spoiled, indulgent, and they lack self-control. They just do whatever they want, and they don't care what other people say, because mommy and daddy will help them out and tell them that they're perfect no matter what. And the third type is authoritative parents. These are like the gold standard parent. These are parents who supply firm and consistent guidance combined with love and affection. They use management techniques, which are approaches that combine praise, recognition, approval, rules, and reasoning to enforce child discipline. They encourage children to take responsibility for themselves, to think, make good decisions. They help the kid understand what the rule is. They'll be strict about the rule, but they're going to explain what it is, and if they have to punish the child, the punishment will fit what they did wrong. These children end up being more resilient, and they thrive even in difficult situations, so they have positive coping skills. They know how to handle themselves. And the fourth type is uninvolved or absent parents. Now, you're probably thinking like, well, my mom is like this and my dad is like this, and that's cool. Like, it's pretty normal for parents to have different parenting styles, and they may not fall clearly into one of these categories. They'll kind of maybe change over time or based on the situation. They may also be different with you than with your sibling, or they may have changed over time. So maybe something happened and they'll become more authoritative than permissive, or they become authoritarian if something bad happens. So parents can actually change their styles over time, just like anything else with humans. I'm also going to put a video about parenting styles in the playlist below. So maternal and paternal influences are kind of what they sound like. So maternal influences are all the influences that a mother has on their children. Typically, this is the largest, which is why I default to talking about moms with babies. But paternal influences are all the influences that the fathers have on their children. Depending on the setup of the family, it may be the father who has a primary caregiver role, but traditionally it's been mothers. But in the more traditional mother as primary caregiver, fathers still play an important role with their children. They're more likely to play with their children, tell stories. They roughhouse, do tactile play, get the child physically aroused, as like, tumbling or playing sports with them, wrestling, tickling, things like that. So that kind of play is very important. They also do, again, a lot of that story sharing and storytelling. All right, so that's the end of this section, and we're going to pick it up talking about language development.